The Scottish Government is pushing ahead with a bill that will make existing law on so-called gender recognition even worse. At the moment, a man can get a birth certificate saying he was born a woman if he can claim to have lived as a woman for 2 years and have medical doctors sign off on it. The Scottish bill will do away with those provisions, so there'll be no medical supervision, and a person who claims to have lived as the opposite sex for 3 months will be able to self-identify their gender. If the person's under 18, they'll need to have lived as for 6 months as the opposite gender. And it's the involvement of under 18s which has really garnered a lot of the headlines in Scotland over this issue. It's a very controversial proposal. So I'm delighted today to be talking about this with Willie Philip. Willie is the pastor of the Tron Church in Glasgow, where he's been since 2004. He's also involved with the Cornhill Trust, and he is an author, and he is a trustee of the Christian Institute as well. So, William, thank you so much for joining us today.
It's my pleasure. It's nice to see you as always, Simon.
Well, this issue then, how do we think biblically about society's confusion about gender? How do we think about this bill, but how do we think about the wider issue in biblical terms?
Well, I think one of the first things to remember is that the Bible tells us not to put our trust in our rulers. Do not trust in princes. There's no salvation in them. Trust God, our Creator. That's what Psalm 146 says. Psalm 118, similarly, put not your trust in man. It's better to take refuge in the Lord than in princes. So we shouldn't go for our understanding of things, first of all, to our public bodies. We should go to God and to the scriptures. And very interestingly, in Psalm 118 there, immediately it goes on to Psalm 119, which is the longest psalm in the Bible, which is all about teaching the way of life. The psalmist has two great prayers: give me life and teach me your way, teach me your statutes. So we find out about life, we find out about who we are, we find out about what is good for humanity, not from our rulers, not from princes, but from God who created us. And it's God who tells us what it means to be human. And for that, we have to go right back to the very beginning of Scripture, where Jesus points us right back to the creation and to what we're told about humanity being created as integrated whole human beings. We are created as embodied persons. We can't separate human life from human personhood. And human beings are made bodily, male and female. And that's the basic starting point. And if we want to know how human society will flourish, how human life flourishes, how human individuals can flourish as they were created to flourish, then we have to go to the Creator's instructions. It's as simple as that. And as Christians, we know that, but we should have confidence in that, because this is not just something that is about the church. It's not something that's just for Christian people. It is for all humanity. And all humanity learn what it is to be human from the revelation of the Creator. And we are those who've been entrusted as Christians with the oracles of God to spread that good news to the world, to teach people what it means to be human and to teach the way of human flourishing. So we have the answers to the questions that people are searching for. And as Christians, we should be supremely confident in that. Opening our Bibles, showing the way of life is the best way, and it's a far better way than we're going to hear from anybody else. So Christians can be supremely confident in speaking about these issues.
So I want to ask you about how we respond then pastorally to this. So I'm going to ask you first about the situation within our churches. I mean, you are the pastor of a thriving city centre church with 3 centres across Glasgow. How do we deal with this issue if it comes up within our churches? If we have people who are members of our churches who embrace this gender ideology, perhaps say they want to identify as the opposite sex, or perhaps children or grandchildren of people in our churches and they're asking us what to do, or visitors. Where do we start?
Well, I think the important thing is that we don't start with anger and hostility, because this is a terrible affliction. It really is a contagion. One of our parents spoke to one of our church meetings a few months ago to tell us that in her daughter's school class, and she's just in second year of secondary school, but by the end of first year, and that's children about the age of 12 and 13, more than 30 of her friends were identifying as non-binary or as trans or as anything other than what they were, as girls. So I think the first thing to realize is that this is a terrible affliction. It's a contagion, and it's not going to bypass churches. Anybody who's living in the world, and particularly whose children is facing up to this issue. And so it's a very real thing. The first thing is we can't avoid it, and we can't pretend it's not going to affect us. But people are being affected by this in ways which are damaging them, and it's a great wickedness, I think, that people are being afflicted in this way. And so we ought to be rightly angry at those who are perpetrating very false ideologies, because underlying all of this is it's not just a small thing. It's a whole worldview. It's an ideology, and as Christians, we would understand that behind all of these anti-God ideologies are dark forces in the spiritual realm. So this is a real spiritual battle, but people are caught in the crossfire. People are ignorant, they're confused, they're afflicted. And sadly, very often these kind of issues we know face those who have had difficulties in their background. Trans confusion and so on is very highly represented among those with autistic spectrum disorders. So these are people who we must show a great deal of compassion and understanding for, and we want to help them. But of course, we don't help people by colluding with something that is damaging them. We all face, I'm sure, well, many pastors and anybody involved in youth work particularly face issues of young people with things like anorexia, for example. Nobody would suggest that we should show compassion or love to them by colluding with their delusional ideas about their body shape and so on, and help them to lose weight even more. And it's really an analogous situation here. So we need to show compassion, understanding, but clarity of thinking, and not collusion with that which is the very thing that's damaging people.
What about in work situations? So many Christians are in workplaces where their employers are asking them to ally themselves with the gender ideology movement. They're asking them to put their personal pronouns on the footer to their emails and so on. How do you think Christians should respond to employers who make those kinds of demands of them?
I think, again, people are put in difficult positions here, but I think that is a different situation from when we're dealing with an individual's personal affliction. I think we're dealing here with the promotion of damaging ideology, and to acquiesce in that and to go along with that, I think is promoting that harm, and B, it's making us complicit in something which is a lie. I mean, we're commanded, aren't we, not to deceive, not to bear false witness. And so by colluding with that which is false and which is ideologically driven is doing that. So I think there is a place there for Christians to resist. We need to be careful, and we need to be courteous about how we do these things. Again, we don't want to come across as tub-thumping, angry people, but I think we can show firmness and explain why we don't want to be party to propagating something which we believe is wrong. And so I think there are all kinds of ways to resist that sort of thing. I mean, the law is on your side. I think this is one of the things that Christian Institute is often very helpful in teaching, is that sometimes people say, oh, well, you can't say that, or, oh, well, I must say that. And usually the case is you can say it, and you don't have to be forced to state things that you disagree with. So it's useful to remember these things. But I think there is a very strong place for firmly but politely and with explanation resisting these things. And my experience is that when people do that, very often they find that a whole lot of others come out and say, well, I feel the same, but I just didn't like to say. And so I think Christians do have to give a lead here. I mean, it's very difficult, isn't it? None of us wants to be the odd one out. None of us wants to be pointed at as the sort of you're engaging in hate speech, or you're lacking compassion. But it's not engaging in hate speech to stand for the truth, and it's not lacking in compassion to do that which is or to refrain from doing that which actually colludes in harm. So again, I think Christians need to be bold, but careful, polite, and firm and truthful.
So just focusing back in again then on this bill that's currently before the Scottish Parliament, it's been very controversial. It's very unpopular with the general public, according to the polls. The idea of 16-year-olds being able to self-identify their gender, or indeed anyone being able to self-identify their gender, it's very unpopular. It's going down very badly. But I want to ask you how the church should respond. Actually, I want to ask you specifically, in the public square, how do you think church ministers should be responding to the controversy and the concern about this bill?
Well, I think first of all, it is incumbent on Christian leaders and pastors to engage with these matters and to teach their congregations the biblical issues that are at stake here. I think, again, it can be easy to try and dodge controversy, and it's difficult, but that is a responsibility for Christian leaders. So our first call is to our churches. But the gospel and the truth of God is not just for our churches, it's for the whole of society. And if we want to teach people how to be those who love their neighbors and they love their communities, then arguing for that which is healthy and against that which is harmful is incumbent upon the church. So I think it's right that Christian leaders should speak out. I also think that, on an issue like this, there is, as you said, there is widespread concern, not just among Christians, but across a whole swathe of, well, really what I would say most right-thinking and decent people. And I think it can be dangerous for Christians to just close the doors and look inward and think about these things only in our own terms. We have a lot of allies in this, and I think that I've certainly found personally that people who have concerns about these sorts of issues are very glad when church leaders, when Christian leaders join with them and join forces with them. We're not against everybody and everything all the time. There are all sorts of things where we can make common cause with people. God's grace is far greater than just the grace in his salvation. We call it common grace, don't we? Or people use different terminologies. But God is good, and he pours good gifts on all his creatures, even upon his enemies. And so there are many who we might disagree with on all sorts of issues. And on this particular issue, there's a very wide coalition, and there would be people who I personally disagree with about a lot of things. But on this issue, we find common cause. And I think it's right that Christians should be in the mix, and that their voice should be heard. And I think we have something valuable to add, and it is welcomed. So I think there are many areas where Christian leaders can get involved. Sometimes we're hesitant because we say, well, does that mean we're neglecting the gospel? Well, I'd be the last person to say that Christian leaders should neglect the gospel. I'd be the last person to say that the work of the pastor isn't principally to preach and teach the scriptures. But it's not necessarily exclusively that. So I, as a pastor, will not turn aside and spend 95% of my time doing your job, Simon, because that's your job. But I will give some of my time to supporting people like you, and I will give some of my time where I'm able, where I have an opportunity, to speak in public or to speak in groups that involve different people other than just Christians, because I do think that's important. And I think if Christian leaders are not heard doing that, Christian people will be unlikely to feel, well, they can stand up and do that. And so one of the reasons that if I have an opportunity to speak out, I'll do that is to show my own congregation and others that, we have something to say and that it's something valuable. And I want to encourage them to do that as well. If a Christian leader's never seen evangelizing with the gospel, it's unlikely that his congregation are going to become great evangelists. But if he's never seen engaging with some of these issues in public life, it's unlikely that they're going to think that those things are important either. And so we do have an example to set in that regard. And hopefully we can set a good example, and we can show a way to engage with these things that is truthful and polite and reasonable and godly, and will not bring shame on the church, but will actually encourage others to do the same. So I think that would be my view on that. I, as a pastor, will not be deviated from my principal task, but my principal task does leave room for other things which are not my full-time principal concern.
So you talked about making common cause on this issue with people who aren't Christians. You were recently in the news in Scotland for making common cause with a group that was cancelled, booted out of a booked venue because, in part at least, of their views on trans issues. Do you want to just briefly tell people that story?
Yes, well, as you know, Simon, you called me up late in the week, a couple of weeks ago, to say, can you possibly help us out? Because there's a conference of, I think, 6 or 7 different groups, mainly academics, but the Christian Institute was involved to discuss common concerns, particularly in the education setup in Scotland with trans ideology and other things and so on. And they had had a long planned conference, which almost at the last minute, just a couple of days before, was suddenly cancelled because the venue staff didn't want to be associated with views that they considered to be not the right sort of views to hold. And we were glad to help out because, well, we wanted to support that particular issue, but also we wanted to prevent this sort of cancellation culture, which is just, it's the very antithesis, isn't it, of how truth wins. Truth wins by being heard. Truth wins by being spoken about and being tested and being argued about. So that was an eclectic group. And I suspect many of those folk would never normally be inside a church. I suspect some of them were perhaps quite surprised to discover that we weren't quite the bogeymen that maybe they thought we were beforehand. I certainly would not be on the same page as some of those folks that were meeting that day on a whole host of issues. But I felt it was a good thing for us to do on all sorts of levels, just to allow these things to be heard. And I think it was a positive statement of the church wanting to have a positive role in public life. We are part of this world as well as the world to come. Paul says we're citizens of heaven, but we're also citizens, in my case, of Scotland. I'm a citizen of Glasgow. I want the good of that city and I want the good of our nation. We can't opt out of that. And I would argue that as Christians, we have the insight and the knowledge from God and from the scriptures to show the best way for human flourishing, the best way for community. And where others agree with us on some of those things, I want to both encourage that which they already know which is good, but also perhaps ask them to consider other particular Christian aspects of these things which they haven't thought about, and perhaps help to show them why some of the things they do hold dear, in fact, when you trace it back, comes back to formation of our culture and our thinking and our understanding in this country, but actually all comes back to the Christian church and to the Christian gospel. So I see it as an opportunity not only to seek the good of the city, but also it's a gospel opportunity. It helps to show people why things that they cherish, actually where they come from. And in fact, they come from scripture. And well, perhaps there are other things in scripture that we should consider a bit more carefully. So I saw that as an opportunity on all sorts of levels, just to be helpful, but also to bring a Christian influence. And I'm glad we had that opportunity.
Do you think we can win the argument on trans?
I do think we can, because just keeping your eyes and ears open, listening to what ordinary people are saying, hearing things that I get told from a host of different people, I think this is perhaps a bridge too far on this whole slippery slope. Somebody just told me the other day that apropos of nothing, a plumber was in their house and they just started chatting to them and just volunteered without even being asked that they were not going to send their child to the local school, but they were sending them to a Roman Catholic school. They weren't Roman Catholic, they weren't religious at all, but they said at least they know in that school the difference between a boy and a girl, and I don't want my children being confused about that. So I think there's a lot of ordinary people right across society who are very, very concerned about this. And when it comes to the issue of children and young people, that focuses the minds. It focuses the minds of parents. And to have the idea that children at the age of 16 could change their birth sex, could do it without any medical input, can do it in just a very short period of time. I think really to all right-thinking people, that is something that is so scandalous that there'll be an uprising against it. Now, what will happen in the Parliament, I don't know. Whether it can be prevented going through in the first place, that's beyond my level of predictable prediction. But I certainly think it's possible, and I think if it does go through, I think there will be all kinds of problems and backlash. And so, yeah, I think we can win this argument because it is simply such an extraordinary assault on truth and an extraordinary assault on plain reality that I think it's unsustainable. But there may be a lot of damage caused first, and that's the great tragedy, and that is why it's worth campaigning very hard to stop this going through the Parliament in the legislation.
Well, William, we're so grateful to God for your wisdom and your courage and your warmth on these issues. Thank you so much for talking to me today. I just think it's so important to encourage people on these issues. They're feeling beleaguered, aren't they, in their churches?
Yeah, they are. Actually, funnily enough, I just got in the post yesterday your new little thing on Gnosticism.
Yeah.
Which is really excellent. It's very, very good. I mean, for a really short little thing, I think that is absolutely super. And I mean, I would like everybody in my congregation to read that. I think you should really make a big thing of this. I think it's the sort of thing anybody can read, and it really, really helps them see the spiritual aspect of the whole transgender thing. Because I think that's something that's missing. I mean, lots of us have been saying for a while that this is just Gnosticism, but I think that little booklet is extremely clear and will help people to see that.
Well, thank you for such a strong recommendation for that resource. And of course, if people want to get a copy of that, they can contact our office at the Christian Institute. Remember, if you want to be kept up to date on these issues, then you just need to go to the Christian Institute's website and join our mailing list. But for now, thank you for joining us today. Goodbye and God bless.